Good evening to everybody, so we won't be bored. I'm looking first at the aspects of marriage in the Old Testament. Despite undoubted examples of polygamy in patriarchal times, for example, Jacob had two wives, sisters, Rachel and Leah, it appears that at an early stage in Israel's history, the monogamous concept of marriage prevailed. And long before New Testament times, it had become the norm. An exception was the royal family, where a harem was a matter of prestige. And here, Solomon is a very interesting case. Solomon, in reality, was a minor princeling, but he presented the Bible as a great king. Remember how the Queen of Sheba was amazed at his wealth. The wealth was so much that there was so much gold that silver was regarded as dross. But when it comes to having a prestigious harem, he really was spectacular, because 1 Kings 11:3 tells us, among his wives were 700 princesses and 300 concubines. That should have kept him going. An interesting point here, though, is because something we're aware of, surrogate motherhood. And that seems a newfangled idea. It isn't. It's older than the Bible. And you have a very interesting passage in Genesis about Abraham and Sarah. In Genesis 16, 1-6. The promise was made to Abraham that he would have a son and be the ancestor of a great multitude. But he and his wife were old, and Sarah couldn't have a child. So how's going to happen? So they had to try to work it out, and they knew that in the culture of the day, because we got an older Mesopotamian code called the Code of Hammurabi, who was a Mesopotamian king, and there the idea of surrogate motherhood was a part of the practice. So they decided this is how it's going to be. But it's a very interesting passage because it's very true to life. Now Sarah, Abraham's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar. And notice now that this is initiated by Sarah. And Sarah said to Abraham, you see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah. So after Abraham had lived for 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarah, Abraham's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave girl, gave her to her husband, Abram, as a wife. He went into Hagar, she conceived. And when she wasn't very clever, this girl, when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress, because it was, a God's shameful thing not to be able to have a child. So here she's pregnant and her wife is not, her mistress is not. And then, this is lovely, Sarah said to Abram, may the wrong done to me by you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked at me with contempt. Now may the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarah, your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please. It's lovely because Sarah had initiated the whole thing, you see. And then when things went wrong, she blamed poor old Abraham. And it's all your fault, and then what did Abraham do? He opted out and let the two women handle it. And we're talking about marriage. And I mean, some of you will probably recognize that that's very true to life. That's just by the way. We move on then to the theology of marriage. We find that again in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. So there, the first chapter of Genesis, humankind is man and woman, and they're both created. Then you have the second account where the man is created first. And then you have the Lord God said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner. The word there is in the Hebrew is ezer. It's often misinterpreted as kind of the wife would be a kind of a helpmate, kind of a crutch. The word ezer, it doesn't mean that at all. The Lord is my helper. Very same word. and the Lord is hardly subordinate. So there's no justification for regarding the woman as being in any way subordinate. So the point being made there really is that only with male and female is the full reality of humankind. But so the man said, "This is then I will make him a helper." And then you have the man's reaction. "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman. Out of man this one was taken." Just coincidentally, the Hebrew pun can be reproduced in English. In the Hebrew, she shall be called Isha, because she's taken from Ish. You know, here she shall be called woman, because she's taken from man. Just purely coincidental, but it just happens. "Therefore a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, they become one flesh." And I describe that as an etiology. That's a technical term for a popular way of describing some phenomenon. And it's the question of the attraction of man and woman, which comes to fruition in sexual intercourse. And so it's because they were one at the beginning. Man is made from the woman, and that explains in a popular way, why they want to come together, because they were originally one. But notice the point, and we'll touch on this again when we look at the teaching of Jesus. It's interesting, in Genesis chapters 2 and 3, it's interesting to read them backwards, because what you have in chapter 3 is the reality, the human reality, because the first 11 chapters of Genesis are theology, pure and simple. They seem to be simple stories. They're profound theology. So they're explaining how, the things like, for example, in chapter 3, the status of women as they knew it. To the woman he said, "I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband. He shall rule it over you." That was pretty well the status of women in the society of the day. But it was felt that there's something wrong about that. And so in chapter 2, you have the man recognizing, "This at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh." That's not a reference to the woman being made from this rib of Adam. It's a way of saying we're kin. They have the man, then you have the animals, and it's found that there's no kin for the man among the animals, so this creature is created specially. Then the institution of marriage. You have betrothal. In Israel, marriage was normally preceded by a promise of marriage, a betrothal made sometime before the celebration of the marriage. Now, betrothal in its juridical consequence is quite different from our engagement, which is no more than a private agreement. In Israel, a betrothed girl belonged to her fiancé in the same way as a married woman did. So it really was marriage, except they weren't cohabiting. In Israel, also the mohar I mentioned earlier, I think, it's a sum of money which the fiancé had to pay to the father of the girl. It was compensation. I mean, she's leaving the family, there's a worker less, so it's compensation. It's not a price, it's just a compensation. And in Israel, marriage was a purely civil contract, and a private, not a public contract, and was not sanctioned by any religious ceremony. Only in Tobit, and we'll see Tobit again later, do we explicitly hear of a written marriage contract. Then Raguel, we'll see the two characters in there's Tobit and Sarah. Then Raguel, the father of Sarah, called her mother Edna and told her to bring writing material, and he wrote out a copy of a marriage contract to the effect that he gave her to him as wife according to the decree of the law of Moses. That's the only reference in the Bible to a marriage contract, but it was the normal thing. Then we look at the status of a wife. By marriage, the wife became subject to her husband. He is her Baal, which is a Hebrew word meaning Lord, her master, just as he is the Baal of a house or a field. She was property. He is the Lord Baal. Juridically, a wife had few rights or none at all. But in practice, we'll see in the wisdom literature, her situation could be very much better than her legal standing might suggest. Within the family, esteem for a woman grew when she became a mother, in particular, the mother of a son. We must remember that the Bible, especially the Old Testament, but the New Testament to an extent, especially in the later writings, is an androcentric text, a male-centered text. It's written by men for men, very much so. Happily today, with women scripture scholars, they're discovering that there are really more women an important feature in the Bible. Men just ignore that. Women are spotting that, of course, and that's something. But still, predominantly, and we'll see that again, even when we look at the New Testament, it's predominantly androcentric, male-centered. The question then, we look at the question of adultery and divorce briefly. Now, adultery, we have to remember in the Old Testament, is viewed exclusively as an infringement of justice, of the rights of a husband. Its very place in the Decalogue is significant. Between murder and theft, you have it there in the handout, you know that it comes murder, then adultery, theft, because it's seen as a kind of a property thing. As envisaged by the law, adultery is sexual intercourse of a man with a married woman. His own marital status is not considered, and an affair with an unmarried girl is not regarded as adultery. So it's a property thing. It's an affront to the property of a man. If you have intercourse with a married woman, you are hurting the man, you know. So it's not primarily, it became a sexual thing later on, but in the beginning it was in that category. The law regarded adultery as a capital crime. Both accomplices must be put to death. We find that in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But there's not a single recorded instance, in fact, of that being carried out. And we find in the wisdom literature, to a large extent, the question, though there were quite a lot about adultery, the idea that it was a capital crime and that if you committed adultery, you were putting your life in danger. And so it's a dead letter. It was in the law, but as far as you can see, and I think the wisdom literature kind of clinches that, it wasn't carried out in practice. Then there's divorce. In Israel, divorce was permitted. A husband could repudiate his wife, but the woman had no redress. The only snag was that the mohar, the price that was paid, wouldn't be returned. You know, so there's a little bit of if you want to divorce your wife, well, the mohar, the money is gone. You won't get that back. It wasn't much of a thing. And the motive accepted, and you have the text there, I think, in the thing about. Well, you have in Deuteronomy 24:1-4. There's only one text explicitly about divorce, and it really is pointing to a particular thing. Divorce was simply taken for granted, but it doesn't. It's not. There's no law about divorce really, apart from this text in Deuteronomy 1-4. It's pointing to a specific situation. Suppose a man enters into marriage with a woman, but she doesn't please him because he finds something objectionable about her. That's going to crop up in the New Testament. And so he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. She then, so that's the thing you just said, a very simple thing. I am not your husband, you are not my wife, the job is done. There's no question of a divorce court, and you give her a certificate so that she can say, well, I'm a free woman now, and she can remarry. But it's all one-way traffic. He could divorce his wife, she could not divorce her husband. She then leaves his house and goes off to another man's wife, to be a man's wife. Then suppose the second man decides to her, writes her a bill of divorce, puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or the second man who married her dies, her husband who sent her away is not permitted to take her again to be his wife. It's a specific case. It means that if a wife is divorced, if a husband divorces his wife, they cannot remarry. You know, today if a divorce happens, it's possible that they could change their minds and remarry. So it excludes that. But it simply takes divorce for granted, that's the point. Then we come to the wisdom literature, and this becomes quite interesting now. The wisdom of 5 books: Proverbs, Job, Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes, Sirach, and the Book of Wisdom. And they're interesting because they're dealing with, you know, life experience, and there is quite distinctive group of writings in the Old Testament where they're dealing with life and thinking about life and so on, and practical down-to-earth wisdom. A feature of them, especially you find it in Proverbs, but more particularly you find it very much in Ben Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, was misogyny. You know, here are some examples of it. For example, just to give an idea. For example, in Proverbs you find these verses. It is better to live in a corner of the housetop than in a house shared with a contentious wife. A continual dripping on a rainy day and a contentious wife are alike. There's several of those passages. And then you have in Sirach, you have any wickedness, but not the wickedness of a woman. There is no venom worse than a snake's venom, and no anger worse than a woman's wrath. I would rather live with a lion and a dragon than live with an evil woman. And this is a lovely one. Her husband sits among the neighbours, he cannot keep sighing bitterly. Now there's an interesting one. And this idea of the contentious wife and so on, in other words, that legally the woman had no rights, but she's a woman, and she can get, you know, just like Sarah gets a poor old Abraham, you know. So they have ways of getting their own way. And the wisdom literature clearly admits that with all that negative thing. But there's also, of course, a positive, and you have the famous one of in Proverbs 31, the capable wife. She's running the household, and she's the boss in a way, you know. So you can read that for yourselves. But we mentioned about the Bible being so male-centered, and this is a lovely passage. The ideal wife we find in Sirach 26:13-18. A wife's charm delights her husband, and her skill puts flesh on his bones. A silent wife is a gift from the Lord. That crops up, and nothing is so precious as her self-discipline. She knows her place. A modest wife adds charm to charm, and no scales can weigh the value of her chastity. Like the sun rising in the heights of the Lord, so is the beauty of a good wife in her well-ordered home. Like the shining lamp on the holy lampstand is a beautiful face on a stately figure. Like golden pillars in silver bases, so are shapely legs and steadfast feet. The guy wants not just a silent wife and a modest wife, he wants a beautiful wife. You know? That's you see the male, this is what he's looking for. You know, he wants everything. So I mean, it's true to life, isn't it? The wisdom literature, it's particularly we find in Proverbs and Sirach. There are 3 categories of people. You have the wise and the foolish. The foolish and not the ignorant. The foolish are the irreligious. The fool says in his heart, there's no God. You know, you have the wise and the foolish. And in between you have the simple, who are really the young. So they have to be eventually there. They start out neutral, but they're going to end up in one camp or the other. They're going to end up wise or foolish. And so the wisdom literature, it tries to lead them into the right path. And so the idea of the warning, particularly we find it in Proverbs, we know in Sirach as well, a warning about adultery, for example, the loose woman. Again, you see the male thing, the woman is the threat. But there's a delightful passage in Proverbs 7. It's a description, I just have to share it. It's a description of seduction, which is absolutely marvelous. So first of all, it's addressed to the young man. Say to wisdom, you're my sister, and call insight your intimate friend, that they may keep you from the loose woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words. And then you have this. For at the window of my house I looked out through my lattice, and I saw among the simple ones, I observed among the youths a young man without sense, passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house, in the twilight, in the evening, at the time of night and darkness. Then a woman comes towards him, decked out like a prostitute, wily of heart. She is loud and wayward, her feet do not stay at home. Now in the street, now in the squares, at every corner she lies in wait. She seizes him and kisses him. With impotent face she says to him, I had to offer sacrifices. Today I have paid my vows. So now I have come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly. I have found you. I've decked my couch with coverings, coloured spreads of Egyptian linen. I perfume my bed with myrrh, and so on. Come, let us take our full of love until morning. Let us delight ourselves with love. For my husband is not at home. He's gone on a long journey. He took a bag of money with him. He will not come back until full moon. So we have all the time in the world. With such seductive speech she persuades him. With her smooth talk she compels him. Right away he follows her and goes like an ox to the slaughter, and bounds like a stag towards the trap, until the arrow pierces his entrails. He's like a bird rushing into a snare. That's a marvelous description, isn't it? Again, it's all the woman's fault. This is the point, you see. And this poor guy doesn't have the wisdom to deal with it. That was just, again, a kind of a... where are we going? Then we... what are we now? Then we turn to the book of Tobit. We turn to the question of romantic love. And of course you have, first of all, you have the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs, that, or the Canticle of Canticles, but the Song of Songs, which means that the loveliest of all songs, that's what it means. It traditionally was seen as a kind of an allegory of the relationship of God and Israel, and then in the Christian thing, Jesus and the church. But clearly, originally, it was in praise of human love, of sexual love, in fact. So the Song of Songs takes its place in the Bible as the exaltation of love of a man and woman. In Israel, human sexual love was seen as intrinsically good. Whether it's a collection of songs or whether it is one elaborate poem, the Song of Songs is certainly lyrical. So as such, it does not teach. It has no doctrine to propound. It's an expression of a state of mind and heart. It's concerned with the mutual love of two young people who quite obviously contemplate marriage. So there is in the Bible certainly this idea of romantic love. We're not sure when the song originated, but we may say that it was edited by wisdom writers after the exile, likely in the 4th century BC. Now the epilogue of the poem would indicate that the author, and certainly the editors, understood it in its straightforward literary sense. And so you have the beautiful passage, 8:6-7. Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, for love is strong as death. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. If one offered for love all the wealth of one's house, it would be utterly scorned. And we turn to an example of it then in the delightful story of Tobit. Tobit is really an answer to prayer. You have, it's surprisingly modern. If you read the book of Tobit, it reads like a novelette, which it is. But it really is presented as an answer to prayer. You have two afflicted characters. You have Tobit and you have Sarah. And interestingly, they are both afflicted and they both pray to God And the prayer reaches, the two prayers reach God at the same moment. At that very moment, the prayers of both of them were heard in the glorious presence of God. So Raphael was sent to heal both of them. You had a whole hierarchy of angels once the idea of angels was invented in the Persian period. And so you had the top, were the top brass, the 7 angels of the face. Heaven was regarded, or the abode of God was regarded as a kind of a high-rise, as a kind of a, with a penthouse at the top, where God dwelt. And you had the 7 angels on the face, were the 7 top brass angels who were in the presence of God. And so when God wanted, particularly, these angels were sent out to privilege people. So, for example, Gabriel was sent to Mary, because not any common or garden angel, but the top brass. Similarly here, Raphael was one of them. In Jewish tradition, we know 3 of them, Michael, Raphael, and Gabriel. In Jewish tradition, the other 4 had names as well. We haven't taken those over. But so the story of Raphael then, God answered this prayer by sending Raphael in human guise under the name of Azariah. And it ends up with the story with the resolution is the marriage of Tobias, the son of Tobit, to Sarah. So it's a lovely story, very human. And so they're married and they live happily ever after, and that's how it's sorted out. But you find the love aspect. Raphael, on the journey to Ecbatana, which is where Sarah lived, Raphael extols her beauty and so on. And when Tobias heard the words of Raphael, he loved her very much. His heart was drawn to her. Even before he met the girl, he's in love. And in the story, the first thing he wants is to get married to her, So it's lovely. But interesting there is important, and things can... they get married. You should read that story. It's a delightful story, and it's very easy to read because it's something that we're quite familiar with. But what's very important is, at the end of it, you have this beautiful prayer of Tobias and Sarah in chapter 8. Blessed are you, O God of our ancestors, and blessed is your name in all the generations to come, that the heavens and the whole creation blessed you forever. You made Adam, and for him you made his wife Eve as his helper and support. You said, it is not good that the man should be alone. Let us make a helper for him like himself. I am now taking this kinswoman of mine with sincerity. Grant that I may find mercy, and that we may grow old together. And they both said, Amen, Amen, and they went to sleep for the night. In other words, they consummated the marriage, no nonsense about it. But interestingly, in the Vulgate, the Latin version of and this is a Christian version, you can see something has happened. In the Vulgate, in the Latin version, at 8:4, the Vulgate specifies that the prayer of the young couple lasted for 3 nights, and only then did the two sleep together. Already the Vulgate had spelled out its view in the angel's admonition to Tobias in chapter 6. You shall take her, Sarah, into the chamber, and for 3 days keep yourself continent from her, and give yourself to nothing else but to prayers with her. And when the 3rd night is past, you shall take the virgin with the fear of the Lord, moved rather for love of children than for lust, that in the seed of Abraham you may obtain a blessing in children. So there already you find this unfortunate emphasis, that I say, obviously these Vulgate prescriptions mark a grave departure from the serenity of the earlier story. There Tobias echoes the inspiring and encouraging note of Genesis 2. The later editions strike an alien note. It's sad that in Christian history they have had the greater resonance that those insertions in the Vulgate. Tobit is in step with the Song of Songs, which celebrates the love of a man and a woman, surely the most gracious of the many gracious gifts of God to humankind. The book of Tobit extols family virtues. The older couples, Tobit and Anna, they are the parents of Tobias, and Raguel and Edna are the parents of Sarah. They're exemplary in their lives, and they have brought up their children well. Tobias and Sarah, in their turn, have a lofty ideal of marriage, and are keenly aware of their obligations to their parents. An atmosphere of faith and trust in God and joyful thanksgiving is pervasive. This little romance needs no one to plead its cause, but it's beautiful insight into the whole idea of marriage, and a very positive and comforting one. And then you have the last point in the Old Testament here, is which is important for an understanding, is the prophetic image of marriage. You have it particularly in Hosea 1-3, an 8th century prophet who introduced this image of Israel as the spouse of Yahweh, or Israel as the wife of God, of Yahweh. And it's not, what's stressed there very much is not the covenant idea, not the contract notion, but in fact the love, and particularly the love of God for his unfaithful spouse. You find that in chapters 1-3 but also you find it in Isaiah. It's taken up by the other prophets then, and you have the passage in Isaiah 54:1-10, where it's referred to the people in exile, and that God is going to hasn't washed. They think that God has washed his hands of them, and this is the assurance he has not. For your Maker is your husband, the Lord of hosts is his name. For the Lord has called you like a wife forsaken and grieved in spirit, like the wife of a man's youth when she is cast off. For a brief moment I abandoned you, but with great compassion I will gather you. With everlasting love I will have compassion on you, says the Lord your Redeemer. For the mountains may depart and the hills be removed, but my steadfast love shall not depart from you, and my covenant of peace shall not be removed, says the Lord who has compassion on you. So the idea there is that even if we were to regard the prophet's use of the marriage image to portray God's attitude towards his people as no more than imagery, we must admit that, granted their elevated notion of God, it witnesses to their high esteem of marriage. Otherwise, they would never have used the image in this context. So that means that the very fact I use this of the relation of God and his people reflects a very fine understanding of marriage. You know, that they regard marriage so highly that they can readily use that image of God and his spouse. So it kind of so it seems that anyhow that's the point. Now we turn to the New Testament. And so we look first of all to Jesus and first of all marriage and then divorce. So in the text, Matthew chapter 19, which the question of divorce comes up, but he speaks first about marriage. Have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate. So he takes those texts in Genesis that we saw in the beginning, and he points out that this indicates God's purpose for marriage. So then but the question of divorce comes up in Matthew 3:31-32. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. He's referring back to that text in Deuteronomy. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of porneia, is the word there used, the same root that you have pornography, porneia, translated, very often as unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. But in Matthew 19, we have some Pharisees came to him And to test him, they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause?" Now that reflects, we saw the Deuteronomic text, a man divorces his wife because he finds something objectionable in her. The text there is very vague. What is something objectionable, or what thou art? But, and so the question is, what are the basis for divorce? And it was a current debate in the time of Jesus, and you had two famous rabbis who had two different interpretations of it. Shammai took a conservative view that the reason for divorce would be adultery or misconduct. But the other rabbi, Hillel, he said he could bring any reason. If, for example, she burned the dinner, that would do, or if you found another woman more attractive. So I think we don't have to think too much about, which interpretation was the popular one. But again, it was all just just the question is, it was the man could, except in Matthew, in Mark you have, it's pretty well the same as Matthew, but then you have Jesus and the disciples are together, and this is a technique in Mark where he introduces something new. And in this case, what's introduced is, in Matthew and in the first part of Mark, Jesus is still operating within the Jewish situation, taking for granted that divorce is a one-way traffic of the man divorcing his wife. But anyhow, Mark, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. Remember, adultery was against the man here. Now he's extending it, and particularly it's extended then to outside the Jewish situation, because in the Greco-Roman culture, a woman could divorce, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So what has happened is they've taken what Jesus said, which is within the context of Jewish culture, and extended it, to the Gentile world, to Gentile Christians. Then we move to Paul, and Paul. This is something very important, because we find it in 1 Corinthians 7, and 1 Corinthians 7 has to be read very carefully, and it has been consistently misinterpreted until quite recently, because it's unique among Paul's letters in that Paul is answering questions, a whole series of questions. Like, for example, here in chapter 7, verse 1, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote," so a whole series, and so chapter 7 speaks of marriage, but Paul is not talking about marriage as such. He's dealing with a particular problem in the Corinthian church. And the situation there was that it's a predominantly Greek church. And so there's a tendency to play down the importance of the body. The Greek idea that the soul is a prisoner in the body, and to play down. Now, interestingly, if you play down the importance of the body, you can end up with two diametrically opposed views. You can have the idea that the body is neutral, and so the notion that, in fact, you find that in Paul, you have where Paul speaks there in chapter 6, where he says, every sin is outside the body, but fornication. Now, you find in most translations, the RSV is correct. In most translations, you have the statement, and all other sins are outside the body. But the text simply says that what the heck is the text precisely? There's no text. There's no sin. Yeah, every sin that a person commits is outside the body. In other words, sin is a spiritual thing. It doesn't affect the body. Now that is not a statement of Paul. That is, in fact, Corinthians' love. So again and again, Paul takes up a statement of the Corinthians and criticizes it. And this is exactly what it does in chapter 7. Now that wasn't recognized until recently, and so there was a serious misinterpretation. So you'll find, for example, in chapter 7, verse 1, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. There's euphemism. It's well for a man not to have sexual intercourse with a woman. Now you see, that was taken as a statement of Paul, which fits as the whole thing. It's not a statement of Paul, it's a statement of the Corinthians, which Paul immediately criticizes. You see? But with that, when that wasn't recognized, then you were wide open to misinterpretation. And so what you have here then is something that Paul goes on, and you have a very firm statement of absolute equality, sexual equality in marriage. You know, but that was lost sight of. You can see if you take that as a statement of Paul, then immediately he contradicts himself. You see? He says, it's well for a man not to have sexual intercourse with a woman. And he goes on, but the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. So it's not a statement of Paul, it's a statement of the Corinthians that he rejects. And what he goes on does is a very, very firm statement of absolute conjugal rights in marriage. It's terribly sad that this was lost sight of and wasn't ignored, and it had something very unfortunate as a result. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. I mean, couldn't be clearer. Absolute. And then he says, do not deprive one another except perhaps, I mean, it's well for a man not to have sexual intercourse with a woman. And he goes on then, do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a set time, to devote yourselves to prayer and then come together again. So he takes absolute sex within marriage as the norm, and that absolute, each has an absolute right to it and absolute equality. Unfortunately, you know, in our tradition, that was lost sight of, and you had the word, the debitum, the conjugal rights. But the emphasis is very much on that the man and the woman should submit, you know. And you could have very serious situations where there was practical rape within marriage, and then the poor woman went to a male celibate priest to get advice, and he was told to submit. It was her duty to submit. It's totally, Paul would reject that right away. But you see, this passage had been vitiated by the fact that it was misinterpreted. You know? So that's an important thing there in Paul's teaching. And then you have, what happened is that in Corinth, and see, you have to understand that chapter 7, Paul is dealing with something quite specific. There were some, you know, those in Corinth who were playing down the importance of the body, and they came up with this notion of a spiritual marriage, of marriage without sex. And Paul isn't very happy with that. He thinks it's unrealistic. And so he says, there in chapter 7, I think I have it somewhere, but so he, for example, he says, so he makes the point anyhow, that I forget where it is, in chapter 7, that the reference is that if you have this situation where a man enters into this spiritual marriage, they're going to have marriage without sex. Well, then he finds it's not really working. And so Paul says, for God's sake, just go ahead and turn it into a normal marriage. You know? So that's why you have to know the background to really understand that chapter 7. The question of divorce comes up there as well in Paul, where he says, even about calling divorce, it's in the handout there somewhere, isn't it? No, that's the Old Testament. Sorry about that. Oh, yes. Yes, 1 Corinthians. If the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such a case, the brother or sister is not bound. There is a situation where you have a mixed marriage, a Christian and a non-Christian. Now Paul is quite clear, if in fact the non-Christian is quite content to live with the Christian in marriage, that's it. But if in fact the unbeliever walks away, then the Christian partner is free. It's divorce. In other words, Paul is acknowledging divorce in that case quite explicitly. If the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such a case, the brother or sister, the Christian, is not bound. So Paul permits divorce in that particular case. The question of household codes is a very interesting one. Household codes, I'm mixed up here now. Where you have them in Colossians and Ephesians, where they were common in the world of the day, and Colossians and Ephesians, and so the passage Colossians 3:18 to 4:1 is a typical household code, where in fact it dealt with the patriarchal family, where you had the man was the husband of the wife, he was the father of the children, he was the master of the slaves. So really, but he was the authority in all three cases, and the others were subject. So you have the notion there in Colossians, where the Colossians 3:18 to 4:1 is a typical household code dealing with the relationship between wife and husband, children and father, and slaves and mothers. So you have examples in the New Testament, Ephesians 5 and 1 Peter as well. In each case, the onus of obedience is imposed on the subordinate second partner. Noteworthy is the elaboration of the master-slave relationship in Ephesians. The text is in favour of a property slave-owning class. Significant is the insistence on the Lord throughout the passage. What has happened is that the Greco-Roman ethic of the patriarchal household has been taken and imposed on a Christian community. What has happened is that a political and social status quo has been brought under the aegis of the Lord Jesus. The change is rough on slaves, but may not at first have impinged too much on free women, but that will change. And the change happens in between Colossians and Ephesians are not by Paul, they're later than Paul, and Colossians would seem to be earlier than Ephesians. So in Ephesians, the emphasis is no longer on slave-master, but on the relationship of a wife and husband in patriarchal marriage. The shift from Colossians is evident. The exhortation in Ephesians, wives, be subject to your husbands as you are to the Lord, is not at all the same as wives, be subject to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. In Colossians, be subject to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. That refers just as a Christian. But be subject to your husbands as you are to the Lord. That's something very different, you know. So in the Lord of Colossians, in the Lord, the element of that Christianizes a Greco-Roman household, subject that you are to the Lord of Ephesians, means something different. In the Colossian situation, one might still make a case for equality of wife and husband. In Ephesians, this is quite ruled out. You have Christ and husband, church and wife. That's the balance in Ephesians. So, I mean, there's no equality there. There's no relationship between equals here. The passage had opened innocuously, be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. But the Ephesian author, without more ado, focuses on wives. Colossians had bidden children and slaves to obey. In Colossians, a wife is subject to her husband. But children obey their father in everything, and slaves obey their master in everything. But in Colossians, in fact, it includes the wife as well. In Ephesians, extends the admonition, in fact, to wives. Let wives be subject in everything to their husbands. You know? So it goes way beyond Colossians. An admonition copper fastened by the parallel as the church is subject to Christ. Already, and so I think that's they made the point there. So you have the notion already, it's the patriarchal household, and so it just takes that thing, which was the pattern of the day, and just imposes it. So there's no real equality, especially in Ephesians, equality. So it's historically conditioned, and the patriarchal idea of marriage is no longer our understanding of marriage. You know? So there's no question of invoking that and trying to introduce the patriarchal thing. But an interesting corollary, which is very serious, in fact, is because I said Ephesians and Colossians are not Pauline, and but certainly the pastorals 1 Timothy and Titus are not Pauline, and you have a very interesting passage in 1 Timothy where it's talking about offices in the church, and it says in 1 Timothy 3:1-7, the saying is sure, whoever aspires to the office of episkopos, which is regularly translated as bishop, it means overseer. It became what we understand as a bishop, but in 1 Timothy to describe it as a bishop, I think, quite misleading. But he's the leader of a church, so he's something that evolved into the notion of the bishop. So whoever aspires to the office of episkopos, of overseer, desires a noble task. Now, an overseer, an episkopos, must be above reproach, the husband of one wife. The translation "married only once" is not right. It's the husband. It means he's a faithfully married. He's a faithfully married man. He hasn't another woman on the side. You know, the husband of one wife. He must manage his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how can he take care of God's church? Very, very serious. The idea of patriarchal marriage was presented as precise the pattern of authority in the church, which is not that of Paul and not that of Jesus. But that's what we're stuck with, you know, and it's most unfortunate. And so finally, just quick glance, we have the notion, we saw the image of the idea of the church as the spouse, or God as the spouse of the church. So that's taken over in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, in fact, as referred to the Lamb, where the church is the bride of the Lamb. The Lamb, of course, is Christ, and you have reference to the wedding feast of the Lamb. The Lord God Almighty has entered on his reign. Let us rejoice and be glad and give glory to him. For the marriage of the Lamb has come. His bride has made herself ready. So he takes over that image already found in Hosea and applied to Hosea and the later prophets to refer to God and his people. And now it refers to the Lamb and the church. So that's a quick run through marriage in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, and probably raise some more questions than everybody. So I'll leave it at that.